coalition with the Peace and Freedom Party, which is primarily a white group. We see it necessary to fight on two fronts. We must liberate the colony as well as stimulate revolution in the mother country. I think that the revolutionary students play a great part in saving America. If it were not for the white students, the Black Panther Party would react to the racism in the country and therefore respond with racism. White students have been very interested in the past of the foreign policy of the United States. They're demanding that the United States withdraw from Vietnam, stop brutalizing the Vietnamese people, and we feel that the white students should relate and pay more attention to the colonized situation here of the blacks first, because after all, this is home. And they should, this is not to say that they shouldn't denounce America's treacherous actions abroad. I think they can be done at the same time. That it's just a matter of placing emphasis upon the criminal activities of America here in the homeland.
Hey, political junkies. Our opening clip this week is from a 1969 KTVU San Francisco feature about the Black Panther Party. That's right, the Black Panther Party. The featured speaker is Minister of Defense Huey P. Newton, discussing the role of white allies in the revolution that the Panthers hope to produce. This week's music, by the way, is the theme from Shaft, which is also from that period, by Isaac Hayes. That's copyrighted music, people, but it's licensed from Lichty, so I can use it. Neil's off this week. I know, I'm sad too, but fortunately, I had the opportunity to bring in another friend who's written a terrific book. Her name is Alice Echols, and let me tell you something about that book. One of the most dramatic moments in the history of 20th century activism has to be July 1964, when black and white students, and some much older Americans too, converged on the state of Mississippi. Since the 19th century, interracial alliances had been crucial to the black freedom struggle and arguably to 20th century liberalism in the United States. That liberalism, after World War II, put race at its center, with activists, policymakers, and philanthropists often coming up short, but pushing forward towards equality nonetheless, an equality that is still imperfect and unrealized. To think of the long civil rights movement as merely a racial struggle is too simple, however. It was a class struggle, a tug between reform and revolution, and part of a global anti-colonial movement punctuated by a series of alliances and ruptures among and between white and black Americans. In each stage of the movement, and particularly after the United States government and the judiciary began to respond to the fight against racism after the war, black and white liberals fought for equality in the streets, the courts, and in every institution that made up the American social order. If you are white, you probably inhabit a variety of institutions today that were segregated, whether you live in the North or whether you live in the South. Mississippi Freedom Summer was when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, determined to flood one state famous for violent white supremacy with liberals committed to breaking Jim Crow segregation. This is where Alice Echols' Black Power, White Heat from Solidarity Politics to Radical Chic, new from Oxford University Press, begins. But that's not where it ends. Echols, professor of history, the Barbra Streisand Chair of Contemporary Gender Studies at USC Emerita, and perhaps the premier historian working on the history of the 1960s today, points us to the complexity of a liberal world that produced both the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, a demand to be included in democratic institutions and the capitalist economy, and an insistence on a revolution that would transform United States society and culture for all Americans. Alice and I had a chance to sit down earlier in June to talk about her new book, and that conversation speaks to the contradictions of our contemporary politics as well. Here's what we had to say. Alice Echols, welcome to the show.
It's wonderful to be here, Claire.
I just want to begin by telling our listeners what a huge fan I am of your work and have been for decades. Your book, Daring to be Bad, Radical Feminism in America, 1967 to 1975, which I believe was a revised dissertation, was it not?
Yes.
It was the book we all needed in 1987 when I was just finishing up graduate school. So that's when I became your fan. And then there was the Janis Joplin biography. And then there was the cultural history of the 60s. And then there was your book on disco. You are the queen of the 1960s historians, I think, Alice.
Thank you.
So let's start talking about this book, which, listeners, I want to tell you what you're going to see is on the surface a story that you think is familiar, and then you're going to find out you didn't actually know that story at all. You begin with SNCC, you end with Angela Davis, and in between we see Black and white activism coming together, pulling apart, and coming back together again. Alice, what made you want to write this book?
Well, I think I had multiple reasons for wanting to write this book. First of all, I teach the 1960s. I just retired, but I used to teach the 1960s. And I had found increasingly that the political purity that I was coming up against in the classroom was driving me crazy. And in 2018, I had taught a chapter from Donna Murch's book on the Black Panther Party, and it was about their survival programs. And a student raised his hand, very smart student, and said, "Where did they get their money?" I tried to explain as best I could where they got their money. And I mentioned liberals just sort of up the road in Hollywood. And I came home and I found I had this email from a very distressed student whose sort of image of the Panthers as these heroic revolutionaries, uncompromising, was destroyed by my comment in class. And I thought, my God, would she prefer that all of those children go hungry? Well, maybe.
Yeah.
They would take money from white liberals or from liberals. That was like the worst thing in the world. So there was that. But I had been slightly involved in the movement. And, I certainly over the years have gone to my share of demos. And I had seen sort of up close some of the problems with the left. And in particular, I think the sort of what Dorothy Healy of the Southern California Communist Party called the worse the better. In other words, Richard Nixon gets elected. Oh, well, that's not so bad. Actually, it's a good thing because, it's going to ratchet up the contradictions. People will understand the system for what it is, the brutal system for what it is. And, we'll be closer to the revolution. Same thing with Reagan. I don't know if anybody much was saying it with Trump, one or two, but.
Oh my God. The Bernie Sanders people, if you were a Hillary Clinton partisan and you said, look, what are you doing? She's going to lose if you keep doing this. They'd be like, well, that's okay. If Trump is president, then capitalism will fall apart. And that's good.
Well, okay, I think I forgot.
Who knew? Yes.
Yeah.
It went into a whole different register. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, one of the things that Healy, it's kind of funny because I would never have thought when I started it that Dorothy Healy and I would be on the same page. But what she said, for instance, to Bob Scheer when he was running in '66 against a liberal, not so liberal Dem in the Berkeley area was, Bob, you think that liberalism is always going to be hegemonic. Watch out. So, I think that to some extent, those were some of the reasons. It was also true as I was watching coverage of the events of the summer of 2020 the protests against the killing of George Floyd, that the commentators seemed to know nothing about the history of Black and white people working together. That interested me. And so, and when I went to sort of look at the more recent literature on the movement, I found that there wasn't a lot that was new about these relationships and these partnerships between Black and white activists. So all of that made me interested.
So the book begins with the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it begins in 1962, 63-ish, as they're beginning to organize in the South, and they're beginning to acquire allies from the North, white liberals, some Black liberals. And the story we have heard about SNCC is we sort of go through Mississippi Freedom Summer, and it's this great triumph of solidarity. Nobody really talks about what happens after everyone goes home. And then the sort of next chapter in the story is, and then SNCC threw out all the white people. Now, part of what I loved about this section of the book is your attention to the details. First of all, that all of the tensions that cause SNCC to crack apart are there from the very beginning. The racial tensions, the gender tensions, the class tensions, the regional tensions. So they're all there, and then they become unmanageable. But can you talk a little bit about these tensions? What was the character of that coalition that comes together in 63 and then produces the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964?
Well, I think it will surprise some people to learn that even Stokely Carmichael, who was in many ways the kind of spokesman for Black Power by 1966, had characterized in his later years those early years in SNCC as a dream inside a bubble. Mm-hmm. And he didn't mean that ironically. I mean, he wasn't dissing, this by calling it a bubble. He said it was almost as if none of those differences existed. Now, I suspect that although there are many other people who I think share that view, it's also true that there were these tensions. I mean, the regional tensions between Southern Black people who were involved in the movement, who were themselves students and had grown up and were living in the South, with Northern Black students who came down and who often apparently came across in a very patronizing way, as though they knew best. They knew better than their Southern counterparts. And indeed, when Stokely Carmichael was voted in as chairman of SNCC, and John Lewis, who had been the chairman for a number of years, lost, Lewis just shook his head and he said, he's not even Southern. He's not even from the South. It was incomprehensible. So that regional difference, which also had a lot to do with education, because, you're talking about Black students who had gone to Howard, versus Black students who were in traditionally, historically Black institutions. And so there was an educational and class component often to that regional difference. Gender difference is very interesting because it plays out, as you know, very differently for Black women and white women. It is inside of SNCC that increasingly white women begin to sort of connect what they're feeling as women and their feelings of disempowerment. They begin to explore that and get interested in it. And some Black women are too, but ultimately they do not get really involved in that journey towards feminism. Whereas really the kind of, the revival of feminism, at least one part of it, really begins in SNCC. Although, interestingly, to complicate even that, the women who are most involved in trying to birth something new, when it happens, they're not there.
Right.
They feel a greater allegiance to the Black movement, to the civil rights movement, than they ever did to feminism. That would be true of Casey Hayden and Mary King, who were two of the people who really pushed the idea of thinking about sexism. But there were an awful lot of sort of cross tensions within SNCC. And they were, as you say, right there from the very, very beginning. And you can see this in the figure of Bob Moses, when some of the earliest joiners, the sort of founders of SNCC, other Black students meet Bob Moses. And this is how I begin this part of the book. They're like, why would he come down here? I mean, Bob Moses, he's from Harvard, he's hyper educated. Right. He looks like an intellectual. He wears glasses, and he's like a stranger to them. It's like,
he's reading Camus, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Existentialism. And they're like, why would he be here? He doesn't have to be here. And so that kind of skepticism about outsiders is there from the very, very beginning. And unsurprisingly is, most often expressed towards white people who are a part of SNCC. Although, again, in the early years, although those tensions are there, people are able to negotiate them.
Well, and then there's the other big tension, which is that white womanhood and the defense of white womanhood is sort of like the core of racial violence in the South. It is the thing that is always being called into public when Black men are being attacked. So there's also a great deal of fear of what does it mean that all these white women are coming south. And I think one of the things I learned from your book that I hadn't really understood is I had always thought that some of that upsurge of feminism among white women was resentment about being asked to do office work and so on, which I'm sure was true. But you actually gave me a logic for that I had not understood, which is Black organizers saying, actually, we cannot be sending white women out there to put Black men and Black women in danger. That's just really not a good idea. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, I think I, too, thought much the way that you did. And I think it is true that, the Black women in SNCC had a lot of power relative to the white women in SNCC. They had positions of leadership that white women didn't have. And one reason, although, again, it's complicated because they were in the office, they were the people making phone calls to journalists, they were the people making phone calls to the Justice Department. They had their own power, but they weren't, they weren't out in the field, and they were not, they didn't actually have a position. They weren't leading anything. They were coordinating the office. But
well, and if I can just interject, I mean, it is characteristic of social movements that they sort of, fragment into jobs that have different prestige. I mean, if you look at ACT UP, for example, the Treatment Action Group became the most prestigious group within ACT UP, and people resented it. And women resented it because only men were in TAG and so on. So it's not uncharacteristic of social movements that this happens, that certain kinds of heroism are lionized and other jobs become the grunt work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think that there was an element of resentment there, and also resentment that people didn't understand how hard that work was.
Right.
Because it was hard. I mean, you were the person, calling Bob Moses in Ohio to say, there are three people are missing. And, and then trying to and then all of it is sort of on your shoulders. What are you going to do? What are the next steps?
Right.
It was very hard work. So there was that resentment. But in terms of trying to organize in the South, it was absolutely true that when people were traveling, Black and white together, in cars, and cars were essential, fast cars were essential in the work that SNCC was doing in these communities, and also knowing how to get out of trouble was essential. Very often white people would be under a rug in the back seat. They would be hidden. And that would be especially true of white women. It was dangerous for them to be in the field, which is why they were in the schools and in the offices and the community centers. It was just too damn dangerous because it was incendiary. There was one organizer, Charles Sherrod, who did work with white people and white women in the field, but even he began to develop protocols because it was so dangerous.
Right. Well, and I want to highlight a couple of things. One is all of these people are liberals. And the meaning of liberalism today has become very one-dimensional. It's the sort of less good thing on the progressive spectrum. Liberal is sometimes a slur that is used by people on the left, and that's been true actually for a couple of decades. But all of these people are liberals, and there are different liberal visions for society and the state and activism that are all coming together in this moment. The other thing that I want to highlight is that actually, although there were a lot of tensions around race and class, there's also something kind of magical that happens, which is white people and black people, some of them trusting each other so completely that they dissolve those differences. And that, of course, is part of what is ruptured when SNCC falls apart. That's when people's hearts are really broken. But that's not something that really goes away, right?
You mean that sort of trust that people have?
Yeah. That it is possible in these movements to develop a trust that is so deep and so profound that, and sometimes, black people in leadership have to kind of defend themselves against accusations that they are partnering with whites and so on and so forth. But that solidarity and love and trust is real.
It is real. And I think that in SNCC, one of the things that really helped to foster it was something that I talk about at length in the book. I think it's really important, and I think it's important for now. It's important for this moment. One of the things that the people who organized the Mississippi Summer Project, better known as Freedom Summer, were aware of was that they did not want, hundreds of white Northern students from elite universities and colleges who had a paternalistic attitude towards the black people that they were working with. And so black organizers in particular would, when they would talk to students at Stanford or wherever, would say, don't come to Mississippi to help the Negro. Come to help yourself. You have to understand your own stakes in changing the system. And that was the beginning of this critique of liberalism. Well, it was one of the beginnings. It was an early indication that SNCC was taking a skeptical attitude towards liberals and this sort of liberal paternalism. You come because you see yourself as an outsider.
Yes.
Not as an insider. Are you an outsider?
Yes.
And you have to develop, in other words, what was necessary wasn't that you were black. It was that you developed a critical consciousness about the system. And that then develops in coordination with the idea that whites should work in white communities. That then begins to cohere and take shape around this idea of organizing around your own oppression, which is the motivator for the draft resistance movement as the Vietnam War is escalating, and for women's liberation, right? As the tensions around, living for young women are heightening. And of course, it would be taken on by other groups. But this love that you spoke of and this trust, I want to point to one example of it, which is in the Panthers. So many people assume that the Panthers were anti-white. Hardly. Especially not in central headquarters, not in Oakland, where they started. Not at all. Partly that's because of the long history of multiracial leftism, and particularly the Communist Party in the Bay Area. But It is very, very striking. And I will just tell one brief story. And it's about a civil rights lawyer named Beverly Axelrod, who was the one responsible for basically getting Eldridge Cleaver, who was in prison, paroled. And they are briefly lovers. They're involved. And it's a very interesting love story, if one can characterize it totally as a love story. You know, Cleaver's a very complicated sort of trickster. But Beverly Axelrod is at one point when Huey Newton is in prison, is in jail, I think at this point, awaiting trial for the murder of a white policeman. So Huey Newton is in jail. He's meeting with a lawyer who's a white left-wing lawyer, Alex Hoffman, and Huey Newton says something to him that that this lawyer feels he shouldn't have told him. It was like, it was the truth. He
Right.
didn't need to know it. He didn't need
Right.
to know it. He said, "Why did you tell me this?" And Huey Newton said, "Well, Beverly told me I could trust you."
Right. And so that trust can also be an extension of other relationships. And I'm glad we sort of moved to the Panthers, because one of the big questions as SNCC is cracking apart, and one of the things that's driving that crack as much as anything else, is that the federal government has responded to all of this activism in the South by sort of beginning to pump money into poor communities. And a lot of the Black people who live there are like, look, Head Start and food and support for cooperatives and so on and so forth. And some of the organizers are just appalled, and they're buying you off. What we wanted was a revolution. We wanted to upend the entire racial system. And the people who had been the object of the organizing were like, no, we never wanted that. And that's actually a really good example of how liberalism could create a scenario in which it was succeeding and failing at the same time. And so we see the rise of Black power as a response to that. There's got to be something else. There's got to be a Black-led movement that is revolutionary. And as you say, some of those relationships endure and some of the style of those relationships endure, but something else happens too, which is it becomes a very performative revolutionary aesthetic as well. Can you talk about what the Panthers were trying to accomplish and what they needed from white people at that moment?
Well, I think, let me just go back a step. I mean, I think that the performative starts, of course, with Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, at Cleaver, or the Cleavers, because Kathleen Cleaver was also, I mean, there was this performative quality, all of them, but it does stretch back to the days of SNCC. And of course, these two groups did try to merge. Which was something that didn't happen, catastrophically didn't happen. In my view, it would have been a good thing if they could have, potentially. But it really it foundered on the question more than anything of the participation of white people in the Panthers, which people in SNCC were not buying. But in any case, in terms of the performative, I mean, the Panthers were trying to model a kind of Black power. There's a great quote, I think it's from Erica Huggins, who talks about how people strutted, how the Panthers, it was so much their style. It was like, after they have their first big action in Sacramento, which is in early 1967, a local newspaper quotes a Black person commenting on it. And he said, this is wonderful. I'm so tired of Black people in the South singing. It's like at last somebody is out there with guns and they're, they're serious, right? And so I think, but, the problem was the sort of, they had a great look, they had a great style, they had the guns, they had the berets, the French resistance, I have to say, the berets, but they had the guns. And as Kathleen Cleaver later admitted, it was, it cut both ways. And, this was, especially for somebody like J. Edgar Hoover, this was terrifying. And especially as the Panthers begin to be in discussions with the Communist Party as they do, that is super terrifying. But I think that whole sort of performative politics, in a certain way, although this is not a point that I make in the book, I would say that in the section on Radical Chic, Tom Wolfe was a very incisive social critic. Now that article, Radical Chic, is riddled with problems, but something that he does notice, certainly, is the performativity of it. And it's also what people like Michael Harrington, Irving Howe, people on the old left distrust about the new left and the Panthers, is the flamboyance. It's what to them feels shallow. But for the Panthers, I would say, it felt as though that is indeed how you organize people. And listen, if you think back to SNCC, one of the things, I think Bob Moses of SNCC was one of the least performative people ever. That was not his aim. He was a very modest person despite his outsized talent. But he certainly was aware that what you had to do in the South was to conquer your fear. And you had to project a certain kind of confidence that you probably didn't feel, but that was really important. And the result was like little kids looking up to you and saying, oh, there's a freedom rider. That stuff did matter, but it wasn't the whole answer by a long ways.
Yeah, and, just briefly touching down on SNCC again myself, one of the connections I made was something you wrote about.
Oh, we have to start over.
That's okay. One of the things I thought about was the ways in which some of the northern white and black organizers began to dress like southern country people, wearing overalls, wearing bandanas, sort of beginning to fall into the way people talked, imitating certain kinds of black language patterns and so on and so forth. And so that sort of like makes its way into the Panther movement in the sense that the Panthers invent themselves. They are not actually imitating anything. They create this costume, they create this stance, they are speaking to and listening to a decolonization movement around the globe. You mentioned the Berets earlier. The Battle of Algiers is a very popular movie in all of these movements. And that style then makes its way into Weatherman. So that when Bernadine Dorn leads the Weatherman faction out of the big SDS convention, she is surrounded by Black Panthers. And she is most often seen wearing a little black leather miniskirt and black leather boots and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of reinvention. What does an American revolutionary look like? And that, too, creates a difference between white supporters who are now more or less allies and black revolutionaries and the few whites that are actually committing to support that revolution, right?
Yeah, true. I think, the thing that's interesting about SNCC is that everybody is doing this.
Right.
I think it's worth mentioning that there are some black veteran organizers in SNCC who during Freedom Summer, when they see all of these, white college students suddenly trying to act like Bob Moses and talk like him and down to the gestures, the hand gestures, are pretty cynical about it. Or or turned off by it. But everybody is kind of participating in it. Julian Bond had said, well, we all were trying to sort of act like Bob Moses. And by the time we got to the Panthers, there's, things have shifted. And, but it is weird. I mean, you bring up Weatherman, and Weatherman gets to the point because Weatherman is so concerned that the Panthers are pals with the CP, that because to Weatherman, the Communist Party was liberal. Right? I mean, it was like...
I'm so glad you said that.
They were like reformists, the worst reformists. And so they begin to distance themselves from the Panthers and criticize the Panthers, which infuriates the Panthers. No one more so than Fred Hampton, who is like, these weathermen, they talk about how I'm like, such an important revolutionary, but they don't talk to me. They don't tell me what they're doing. And Hampton is bitterly opposed to the weathermen's stupid days of rage action in Chicago in October of '69, which only further provokes the Chicago police. And keep in mind, it's just, weeks later that Hampton and Mark Clark are killed in the Panther office. But Weatherman, I mean, they make an interesting move, sort of from allies to the true revolutionaries, right?
Right.
And yet, I mean, at the same time that central headquarters in Oakland decides they're cutting all ties with Weatherman, Eldridge Cleaver in Algiers is like, oh yes, right on. And there are some New York Panthers who also are convinced that weather is a good thing.
Well, and they are able to ally with them.
Yeah,
I mean, they're able to. Let me just toss this in. They're able to ally with them, and again, the question of money becomes really important, because how these Black revolutionaries fund themselves after the Panther movement is basically dissolved by the police is through bank robberies, and white weathermen help them. And whites are able to do things and go places undetected that Black revolutionaries cannot. So there is this kind of alliance that is both, once again, trusting, loving, comradeship, and a marriage of practical convenience in which white people really have a job that they can do to support Blacks. Okay, now you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is right. I mean, you're obviously, pointing to the Brinks robbery, which involved some former weather people like Kathy Boudin and Judy Clark and Dave Gilbert. But I mean, a couple of things, a couple of thoughts. I mean, as I worked on weather and I listened to some of the people that I was interviewing who were close to the Panthers, these were white collaborators and allies, I came to share their view that the white people who were most valuable to the Panthers were, they were the people giving them money. And that was a pretty interesting cast of characters, including this famous Hollywood producer who was very good friends with Huey Newton, who was white. But that it sort of goes beyond that in some sense they were more important. But we tend to think that, white allies, they're always going to wimp out. Actually, sometimes you want them to wimp out, maybe. Right. At least if the alternative is weatherman. It's not a bad thing to have people who are prepared to give you money and who don't want to compete with you for the status of who's the most revolutionary, which is what you got with weatherman. So I think that was something that I came to really feel as I was working on this book, that you need money, and perhaps the best thing possible is to get it from people who are going to support you and aren't going to compete with you. Right. Now with the Panthers, you talked about practical aid, and that's what the Panthers really got from their white allies. I mean, there were not a lot of black lawyers around to defend Panthers. The Panthers, being as confrontational as they were, needed lawyers. So white lawyers, white writers, white countercultural papers that produced a different narrative from the Washington Post and the New York Times and all those other papers, white doctors and nurses. I mean, the cast of characters, real estate agents, they all served in a very practical capacity for the Panthers. I mean, they really made it possible for the Panthers to be the Panthers.
Well, and as you point out throughout the book, it costs an astonishing amount of money to run a social revolution, whether it's SNCC and all of those people that had to be fed and driven places and housed and so on and so forth, or whether it's the Panthers who are running a series of social programs in cities, but then once the police and the federal government goes after them, they have to have bail, they have to have defense money. They're just, so we're talking about money in the tens of thousands back in the 1970s, which is more like the hundreds of thousands today. So I want to make a turn back to Leonard Bernstein because I think this is a part of the book everyone who buys it should look forward to, because you really dig into what happened at that famous party. And I remember reading Jamie Bernstein's memoir in which he said, my parents were traumatized about this for the rest of their life. It was the most terrible thing that could have happened to them. Maybe, maybe not. But it is also true that their idea, Felicia and Leonard Bernstein's idea of what they were doing, was both actually extremely laudable and was kind of lampooned by a range of people in New York who seemed to be a subset of liberals, white liberals, who were just kind of done with the Black Revolution at that point. Can you just sketch for our listeners what they're going to find when they read this part about Leonard Bernstein and the famous party and Tom Wolfe's article?
Well, yeah. First of all, these kinds of what people would call cause parties stretch way back. I mean, at least in America, to the early 20th century. And so they aren't, often people imagine that they just sort of arose in the 1960s, but that's not true. I mean, they sort of rose up again from the ashes of McCarthyism. But I would say that Felicia Bernstein really wanted to have this party because she was convinced by somebody who had been very much a part of the CP orbit, whether or not she was a part of it, Hannah Weinstein, that it was the right thing to do to have a party, to host a party that would not only raise money for the Panthers' defense, because this was the Panther 21 trial, and although they were not all 21 there were about 12 who were on trial. It was very expensive, multiple lawyers, and just the fees for copying the transcript were enormous. You needed a lot of money. So she was trying to raise money and raise consciousness about the fact that the Panthers were being denied their civil liberties. It was very laudable. Leonard, I think, had somewhat different view of this. I'm not sure they were exactly on the same page, and he was not meant to be there, which is why for years afterwards, he would say in a very irritated fashion when reporters would ask him about him, "It wasn't my party." And it wasn't a party, first of all. It was a meeting.
Right.
But I think that it is really fascinating, the kind of coverage that party got in the New York Times, because the person who wrote it up, Charlotte Curtis, was the society writer. She was the women's page writer. She had enormous power at the Times and would soon be elevated to the editorial page as the editorial page editor. She's very powerful. She was an ally of the Panthers. She was part of the committee to defend the Panthers. And yet she wrote this devastating, not the first take that appeared the night of the benefit, the next day, what appeared everywhere across the world was this pretty devastating takedown that made Leonard Bernstein in particular look really foolish. But so that laid the ground. And the people who had worked with Charlotte Curtis in the committee to defend the Panther 21 were shocked and felt just absolutely devastated by this piece. And they weren't able to get any more parties on Park Avenue. That was it, that was done. And the Panthers were pretty bitter about it because they were really looking forward to more of these parties in that neck of the woods for obvious reasons. Now, the real damage, however, was done by Tom Wolfe, the new journalist, who used novelistic techniques to sort of, make his stories sparkle. And he was a wonderful writer. He was also conservative, though nobody knew it. It was not something that he really put out into the world. It was sort of hidden there, but he was conservative, and he had hated the left for decades and had written about the cause parties of the 30s very critically for his dissertation at Yale in American Studies. So Wolfe's reporting in New York Magazine about Felicia Bernstein, or he put it as the Bernsteins' benefit for the Panthers, it was beautifully written. It was an incredibly effective takedown. He made them seem absurd. He made the whole of the movement seem like a charade, like the Black Panthers seemed like they weren't really very serious. Why were they in Leonard Bernstein's, penthouse apartment? These liberals were clearly hypocritical. They were playing at revolution. Nobody was very serious. This was radical chic. It was something they were doing because it was fashionable, but it was meaningless, really, except that it wasn't meaningless because there was a sub-theme there that this was dangerous. And Wolfe would later say that it was the beginning of political correctness. Let me just point out that this was a critique, this radical chic critique that the Nixon administration and the Nixon campaign ran with. They characterized George McGovern, Nixon's opponent in 72, as Mr. Radical Chic. Incredibly effective. And for years thereafter, you can find these articles. Anytime there was a radical cause in which wealthy people, especially celebrities, were involved, it was radical chic. And this is true around the George Floyd protests in 2020 when Senator Tom Cotton decried radical chic among the protesters. And so one thing to note, I think, is that the left at the time never took this critique of radical chic very seriously. I mean, if anything, they kind of laughed along with Wolfe and thought, well, yeah, the Bernsteins aren't serious, Why should we pay any attention? And yet, a movement needs moderate supporters.
Right.
Movements need money. They need moderate supporters. And if anybody has any doubts about that, page 1 of the introduction of Project 2025 says that what conservatives need to do going forward is to do what conservatives did in the 1970s with radical chic. They need to develop a kind of discourse against wokeism. And that is precisely what has happened. And we haven't focused enough on the importance, the significance of the attack on the liberal elite supporting the movement for social change around racism.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I don't know how much time you spend on X, but one of the things you can see on X every time there's a No King's Day or some kind of major protest is right-wing influencers saying, did you notice that all the people at the No King's Day march were old? Or to characterize movements as being driven by white women, or, that there is this sort of use of identity against the social justice movement. I think the other thing that this really made me think about, Alice, was the recent protests and continuing movement among students on behalf of Palestine. And I sort of feel like there are all these little threads from the past that once you pointed them out, I saw them, like the wearing of the keffiyeh, as an act of solidarity, but also as a way of saying, I am not who I seem to be. I am in my heart a Palestinian. The accusations against many of the students that they must be self-hating Jews if they are Jewish students, rather than people who are digging deeply into themselves and trying to make a revolution from within by transforming. There are just so many of these little threads, and that once I read this book, I could just see them, or the accusations that the students are just being performative. And that is certainly one thing we see from the MAGA influencers, is all protests, all efforts to oppose Trump are merely performative. They have no actual substance. And so each of these things, it seems to me that this is a book everyone should read now to understand the kinds of social conflict and movement politics that are emerging. But I always like to end by asking the author, why do you think our listeners should read this book now?
Well, I would say a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there is so much cynicism about the ability of people to actually work across difference. And I think you have to acknowledge difference to work across difference, in order to achieve something like solidarity. It is hard work, and I don't mean to in any way downplay or minimize the amount of both good and bad trouble that you'll probably generate and feel. But it is worth the try, and I think that my book does show that it can deliver real results. So I think that mine is not a sentimental or romanticized account, but it is a hopeful account. And so because it shows that change can happen. I would say that it is also really important for people to think about the fact that hegemony doesn't just occur. It can't take hold just among poorer people, the sort of disenfranchised. It takes on board everyone. Mm-hmm. That consent takes everybody on board. And it is really important it's really important for people to understand that if there is to be any kind of success in pushing back against what's happening, it's going to have to involve people with whom you probably disagree about a lot. Including people who are the so-called liberal elites. I mean, I really do think that that's crucial. I think one of the only people who's really written about this is Masha Gessen. And the extent to which authoritarianism goes after those elites, whether they're in museums or universities or in journalism, wherever they are. And we have to be conscious of that, and we can't get, I think it is important to be as generous as we can be. That doesn't mean losing your focus or your critical edge, but you have to be able to also reel that in.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is the theme from Shaft by Isaac Hayes. Copyrighted music licensed from Lifty. That's all for now. See you next week.
private dick. That's a sex machine to all the chicks. You're damn right. Who is a man that would risk his neck for his brother, man? Can you dig it? Who's the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about? Right on. You see, this cat Shaft is a bad mother.
Shut your mouth.
What I'm talking about, Shaft?
Well, we can do it.
He's a complicated man, but no one understands him but his woman.
John Shaft.